Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to another fabulous 204 lecture, sociology. This one is on social interaction, and I really like doing this one because this is kind of news that you can use. This is some of the stuff on the micro level of sociology that focuses on interaction. That's actually applicable, applicable. Happy Cinco de Mayo. That you can apply to your everyday life. And so we've already talked about some elements of social interaction. We've talked about socialization and kind of having a personal micro level interaction with our family and our peers and religion and our school and so on. We've talked about the social construction of reality, the way that we learn what reality is, including what God looks like, is on a micro level. And so we're going to be talking about a concept in this section called dramaturgy. Dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is the notion of drama and turgy. I don't know what turgy is. But you've heard the Shakespeare phrase, all the world's a stage and the people are merely the players. We're going to talk about how we play roles. And so we've talked a little bit about roles, and we're really going to be discussing a guy named Irving Goffman, who's a great Canadian sociology. In fact, he's so big, he becomes an adjective, sort of like something can be Marxist, or something can be Durkheimian or Weberian. You also have Goffman-esque, and we're going to talk about what's Goffman-esque today in this little video. Okay, so dramaturgy is the notion from Goffman that we perform roles. We are actively doing roles. And we've talked about this a bit when we talked about gender as a performance, that we perform masculinity or femininity as it's defined by our culture and that particular time and place in the world. And so when we talk about dramaturgy, we're talking about the notion of sending messages through our performance. So if you will, for a moment, imagine that we're going to see a play. We're going to see a great Shakespeare play, maybe down in Ashland, back when they start having plays again. And there are players who are up on a stage. They're in costume. They're reading their lines. We are in the audience, and we're sort of paying attention to the messages that they're sending. And it's a full performance. Well, we engage in full performances all the time. So like those actors, for example, we have a front stage and a backstage. For the actors in the Shakespeare play, the front stage is when they're on stage performing their lines, to be or not to be. And the backstage is when they're done, right? When they're on stage in the Shakespeare play, they're reading an iambic pentameter, and they might have an English accent, and they're, every move is sort of calculated. And when they get off the stage and go backstage, maybe they're lighting up a cigarette, speaking in their normal accent. I mean, this is one of the things I've learned about a lot of my favorite actors in TV shows. A lot of them are English. Like half the cast of Walking Dead are all English actors. When you hear interviews with them, you're like, what? Huh? When they're backstage, they're being their normal self. Their body language changes, the way they talk. Yeah, if you've ever seen Daryl from the guy that plays Daryl on Walking Dead in an interview, his real life is a completely different character than this sort of strong, silent character he plays on your favorite zombie show. So we have front stage and backstage. So we'll use the example of a teacher. A teacher, let's say a high school teacher, when they are teaching their class, they are in the front stage. And they are acting a certain way, they are talking a certain way, they are conducting themselves a certain way, they are wearing a certain type of clothing because they're in that performance. And then they walk out of the classroom and they are backstage. I mean, I always wondered about the teacher's lounge. Like the teacher's lounge must be like this den of iniquity. I always think that it's just sort of black lights and lava lamps and people smoking hookahs and talking shit about the students. But if you've ever had the experience of seeing one of your school teachers at a grocery store or at a restaurant or at a bar, it's very disorienting because they're used to seeing them perform their role and not as an actual human. So we have this notion of being front stage. And the example we'll use comes from Goffman, is how we are front stage in a job interview. The job interview is a classic example of dramaturgy, how you are performing for your audience or the person you're applying a job for, and you're going to change yourself so you get that job. You're going to be performing a role. And one of the things that's interesting now in front stage and backstage is that you keep your backstage kind of private, right? When you're performing a role, those teachers probably don't want to run into you at the grocery store, because then you see that they eat and they're normal human beings and they do all the things that normal human beings do. You want to see them in their role. And in the era of social media, we've given people a window into our backstage, right? You can see all the embarrassing pictures from our life and what we're really like. I mean, there was just an article that came out this week about what, because of the lockdown, Kylie Jenner got caught without her makeup on. I mean, here's a woman who has a very front stage performance, and then when you see her backstage, sans makeup, you can't believe it's the same person. I have to do a double take. Like, that is not really Kylie Jenner, because she does such a good job of performing this role as Kylie Jenner versus Kylie Jenner the backstage. So then the social media, I mean, this is the thing. If I get a Facebook request, a friend request on Facebook from a student, do I really want to let them into my backstage? Do I want them to see my embarrassing pictures from the 80s, or, what I'm doing when I'm not in a classroom? I mean, you better believe now, if you're going on a job interview, as soon as you walk out the door, the first thing they do is Google you to see what you're really like. And I know this is a normal course of events now in job interviews. As soon as you leave, they do a little search of your backstage. So this is just, clue number one. Watch what you post on the internet, because it's going to be used as evidence of what you're really like versus what you're performing. So the first part of dramaturgy is the notion of front stage and backstage. Sometimes we're on stage and then we're backstage. And Goffman argues that often when we go off stage, we leave our job and then go home, we're on another stage. And do we ever really get to the true backstage? Are we always performing for somebody? When you go from work to home and with your friends, all those are sort of little stages where you can be in a performance. And there is, an argument to be made at some point in a relationship, you start getting real. Like, I think in a relationship, the first time you can fart in front of the other person, all of a sudden, like, you're officially backstage. But in relationships, there's a lot of performances that last a long time, and then you find out, oh, this is what this person is really like. They weren't anything like this on date 1 through 27. Now I'm seeing what they're really like. I'm backstage with them. So backstage, front stage is the first part of dramaturgy. The second part of this is how Goffman talks about how we manage our interactions. How we manage our interactions on a micro level to try to control the setting when we're in a performance. And he talks about 3 ways. Oh, it sounds like a final exam question. 3 ways that we manage our interaction on the micro level. The first is what he called civil inattention. Civil inattention is about the power of eye contact. That we create connections with people through our eye contact. Shakespeare, speaking of, said the eyes are the windows of the soul. So you know how it is when you can make eye contact with a person. So imagine you're in a bar. Bars, remember bars. And you see someone that you're interested in. The first thing you want to do is catch their eye. Because if you guys look at, you lock eyes, you're in. That's the start of your relationship. You have an opportunity to start talking. That performers on stage are really good, musicians especially, at making eye contact with their audience. I would love telling the story of seeing Paul McCartney play to like 90,000 people in Atlanta in 1990. And I had 4th row tickets. And at one point I stood up on my seat. I mean, this is Paul, the Beatles, Paul McCartney. And he looked right at me. I had a relationship. I had a moment with Beatle Paul, Sir Paul McCartney. And if I ever run into him again and be like, remember 1990 in Atlanta? Remember that moment that we had? It's like, oh yeah, sure, Randy, man. I remember. Yeah, right. Oh, peace and love. And so we establish relationship through eye contact. But what civil attention also refers to is that we can stop that to prevent relationships, to regulate relationships from happening. So here's the alternative of being in a bar. You're in a bar and you notice somebody looking at you and you don't want them to talk to you. What do? Right, you're doing everything. Is he looking at me? Is he looking at me? Is he looking at me? You're doing everything you can not to. Civil inattention. You're blocking off the eye contact to prevent a relationship. Maybe even a better example is you're, driving and you get off the highway and there's somebody with a sign that says, "We'll work for food," and they're looking right at you. And where do your eyes go? Like, they go up, look, a bird. I mean, they're looking sort of everywhere in the world but at that person, because once you make eye contact with that person, you got a relationship and you might feel obligated to give them $1 or something. So And I think in this era of cell phones, do we still call them that? You have the perfect opportunity for civil inattention. Somebody wants you to sign something, or they want you to, donate something, or what. You just look at your phone. I don't see him. I don't see him. I don't see him. Civil inattention. So regulation technique number 1 is civil attention, blocking off eye contact. Regulation technique number 2 is what Goffman called studied non-observance. Studied non-observance has to do with embarrassing situations, that we all do things that are embarrassing. The example he used is forgetting somebody's name, which happens to me all the time. It just, I'm not good with names, right? You forget somebody's name that you should know. But there are all kinds of things you can think about. You got bad breath, you got something hanging from your nose, your zipper's down, you farted, your stomach's rumbling, you got toilet paper on your teeth. I mean, there's any number of things that we can do. And in a situation among children, they will point that out, and they will use it to have some power over you. Hey, you've got your zipper down, or you got something stuck on your shoe, or your breast stinks, But when we're adults, studied non-observance means we have an agreement. We don't acknowledge those embarrassing situations. Why? Because sooner or later, it will happen to us. So we want kind of a social agreement. This is what Goffman argues. A social agreement not to use those, not to observe those embarrassing situations. Because sooner or later, like karma, it will come back to us. That we don't use that to sort of put somebody down. We don't pay attention to it. Somebody's breath stinks. You keep your mouth shut. Somebody's got their zipper down. You don't say anything about it, right? We just sort of, and then, the hope is at some point you have an intimate relationship where they will say, hey, you want to stick a gum? No, you want to stick a gum. And PDQ, XYZ, examine your zipper. And we'll kind of break through the studied non-observance. But studied non-observance, number 2, is all about sort of regulating interactions by not acknowledging embarrassing situations. Number 3 is the big one. Number 3 is the big one for Goffman, and it's about what we call impression management. What do we call it? We call it impression management. Impression management refers to all the things that we do to give off a certain impression about us. So let's go back to the job interview, right? You are definitely going to practice impression management at a job interview. You're going to dress appropriately, like you're not going to come in on cutoffs and a t-shirt. You are going to change your body language. You are going to speak differently. You're going to talk like you know what you're talking about. Your whole demeanor, right down to your costume, maybe even some props, like you hold a pen in your hand. I mean, if you watch cable news when they have the experts, a lot of times they'll have a pen in their hand and just talking like a pen, because it just means that you're smart. Like you might write something down at the moment. You might not use it, but we also do impression. I mean, I think about this a lot when I testify. When I testify in a trial, I bust out the suit. Not only do I bust out the suit, I put on the tie. Now, the necktie is like the most pointless thing in all the world. Why would anybody wear a necktie? I mean, it has no functional value whatsoever. Think about it. No functional value. Doesn't keep your neck warm. Doesn't keep your shirt together. It doesn't do anything, right? It is a signifier that I have a position of authority and knowledge. You need to listen to me. And normally when I teach this class on the very first day, I get all dressed up on the first day and put on my suit, my testifying in court suit, to walk into the classroom to say, hey, I'm the professor. Pay attention to me. I'm the position of authority. And so when I'm testifying in a trial, I put all that on. Why do I put it on? Because the jury might believe me a little bit more intently if I'm dressed in my suit as opposed to a t-shirt. Right? If I show up in court like this, I'm like, who is this joker? But if I show up in a court, they're like, in a tie, they're like, who is this guy? He's, nice tie. And so that's a form of impression management. We also use stuff. We use props to manage our impression. So here's a question. Have you ever had somebody coming over to your house to visit, maybe a family member or something, and you spend all day cleaning? Just clean. And then when they show up, what do you say? Excuse the mess, I haven't had a chance to clean. Why? Why do you clean? Why shouldn't they see the way you live on a normal day? Why do you clean up the house when somebody's coming over? right? You are trying to give an impression. You are trying to create a setting that says something about you. I mean, I think about this in this house. We have a lot of books. I have like a bookshelf in every room. The books in the living room, if you're coming over to visit, I have a lot of like French literature and feminist books and, scholarship books. And, so people are like, oh, man, he reads some good stuff. There's some Jack Kerouac there. And then in the bedroom, it's like rock biographies and magazines and stuff. That's the stuff that I'm really reading. The stuff that you hang up on the wall. What are the impressions that you want to give? Yoko Ono, right? I like avant-garde artists and women and people that other people hate. I'm giving an impression. So we all do this. The type of car that you drive. There was a study done about hybrids about 10 years ago, and it found there was the Prius, which is, Toyota's preeminent hybrid car. And then there's also cars like the Honda Accord, I think, where there's a hybrid version and a non-hybrid version, and found that people were willing to spend more money on the Prius because they wanted people to know that they were driving a hybrid. Because if you're driving an Accord hybrid, maybe it's a hybrid, maybe it's not, you don't know. But you're driving a Prius, that's definitely a hybrid. People were managing their impression. So that impression management is very powerful, and something that we do. So in the job interview, a first date, right? You brush your teeth an extra few minutes on a first date, take some gum, make sure you're dressed right, your posture might be a little bit different, the way that you refer to things a little bit different. So these are all things that are used to manage interactions. One of the things that sociologists have pointed out is some of this might be culturally bound. So that, for example, the notion of eye contact. In some cultures, eye contact is a challenge. If you want to defer to authority, you look down on the ground and you don't make eye contact. In our culture, you're supposed to make eye contact or else you must be lying. I mean, my mother would say, Randy, look me in the eye and tell me, if that's true or not. And she'd like automatically know. But if a cop is dealing with some, say, Laotian kids and it says, what happened here? And the kids are all looking at the ground, the cop might assume that these kids are lying because they're not making eye contact. So some of this may be shaped by sort of Western culture. And wearing a tie isn't as important in other places in the world as it is here. But it's very useful. And then, someone who was inspired by Goffman, this guy named Paul Elfman, went into the detail about how complicated our interactions are. When we are talking to each other, how much information is being passed back and forth. The types of, often when you learn a language, you're learning it very simply. Like I, learn to translate Spanish literally. But there are all kinds of innuendos and nuances and subtle things that are being said that often I'm missing out. I mean, if you think you're reading English, see Jack run, right? But there's all kinds of things going on. See Jack run. Like, you know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm saying? You don't want to say, you know what I'm talking about? I mean, we often use a lot of complexity in our language. And Elfman talked about this. He talked about the way we use words, including slips of the tongue, saying something that, might be sort of have a sexual meaning to it, for example. The level of our voice. How do you know if something's a question? How do you know if something's a question? How do you know if something's a question? Right? We're listening to the arc of the sound of the voice. How do you know if it's a joke? How do you know if I'm being funny or not? If I'm being ironic? Right? We are interpreting all these clues in the sound of the voice to try to code, oh, he's just joking, or he's being, it's sort of like when Trump was saying people should drink bleach, and then later he's like, I'm just being sarcastic. Like, that is not the sarcastic voice. He should have said, people should drink bleach, and then rolled his eyes, and, that would have been sarcastic, but it's not sarcastic. All that winning. Elfman talks about body language. What our body is like when we're saying it. Are we saying it angrily with our eyes wide open? Or are we kind of laid back and saying it? Are we smiling? Are we invading someone's personal space? Are we, looking like we're making eye contact, or we're looking someone in the eye while we say it? And so he's arguing when there is just a simple piece of information, like, for example, you guys did really well on your midterm. You guys did really well on your midterm. You guys did really well on your You guys did really well in your midterm. I mean, there are all kinds of different interpretations that you're going to take those words, all exactly the same thing. You guys did really well in your midterm, and interpret different things from them. Some of you did really well in your midterm. And so that is about the complexity. And how do we learn that? This is symbolic interactionism, y'all. We learn it through social interaction. We learn what ironic looks like. We learn what sarcastic looks like. We learn what humor looks like. We sort of learn what all these cues mean. Like, oh, no, he's just joking. That's not his serious face. That's his joking face. So an example of this, if we were going to bring gender into this, is the power of the male gaze, the power of men looking at women, right? This is the idea that we talked about in gender socialization, is women are there to be looked at in this patriarchal definition of gender that we have. And so men can really like undress a woman with his eyes, like if you heard that line, where women are supposed to avert their gaze. I mean, some of this can be very, very gendered and challenging of gender roles and how men and women respond to this. And I'm going to include something that's very inspired by Goffman. There's this great comedian named Eliza Schlesinger. She's so amazing, and she really pokes holes in a lot of the social construction of gender and the dramaturgy around gender. She's got a new series on Netflix that's hilarious, but I'm going to include a link in this, is the idea about how male and female performances vary and how women perform in front of men. So I'm going to include that link. Please click on it before. It's hilarious, but it's super Goffman-esque. And speaking of gender, one of the things we talk about is how language becomes gendered. So on this last part, I want to talk a little bit about how, next to the last piece, a little bit about how language is gendered in our social interactions. There's sort of three issues here. First of all, the notion of control, that women are possessions, that boats and guitars and cars are often named after women because men are supposed to own women. So, of course, B.B. King's guitar is called Lucille. I just put a B.B. King record away. You name things after women or give them female names because women are supposed to be owned. The way that we change, we talk about marriage in a way a woman goes from Miss to Mrs. and she changes her name from her father's name to her husband's name. And then, and not that long ago, as women's full names, they'd be like Mrs. Joe Blow. Like my mother was Mrs. Robert Blazak. Like she just completely disappears and all that because when you're married, you become a property of someone else. So the first element of gender and language is control. The second is the notion of values, how we devalue women, how women and girls are seen as less than. So we talk about poet and poetess, actor and actress, waiter and waitress. I mean, there are all these ways of lessening women. And then, the idea of part of this is the feminine as the insult. Hey, ladies, think of all the ways that boys bully, feminizing terms that they use. And that shows that we devalue the female. And the third part, control values, and the third part is, again, what we would call normative maleness, how we assume the male. Everything is male. Somebody takes this class, he's going to learn a lot. I looked at the roll, there's more females enrolled in this class. I should say if somebody takes this class, she's going to learn a lot. But we always assume the male. Even among animals. When we go to the zoo, when Cozy and I go to the zoo, people assume all the animals are males. Look at that monkey, he's so funny. Look at that cow, you can kind of tell with the cow. Maybe you should take a look underneath. I think that cow is a she. Like male cows don't have udders, Holmes. But we assume everything is the male. So that little riddle, and I'll tell it again. So as an example of normative maleness, is a perfect example of how we assume the male. That if a father and a son are out spending the day together, a man and his 10-year-old son, and there's a car crash, and the father is killed, and the son is grievously injured and taken to the emergency room, and the doctor looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this child. He's my son." Who's the doctor? The first time I heard that, I was like, stepdad? Like, doctor is the mother, dumbass. But we're so conditioned to assume the male. And then if we talk about gender, that means we're going to talk about women too. Like, gender studies are about women, right? Because men don't have gender. Men just are. Men just are the norm. Because God created, I always get that backwards. God created Adam first, right? So the norm is maleness. And so that's reflected in our micro level interactions. And the last thing I want to say, just at the end of here, since I was talking about Liza Schlesinger, is about humor and learning about what's funny, what is off limits. When I was a kid, I'm looking for a book up here somewhere that had a book that was like full of Polak jokes. We told jokes about Polish people, and it was hilarious. How many Polacks does it take to screw in a light bulb? Like the Poles are awesome. Poland like brought down the Soviet Union. Like Poles now are like badasses. God bless the Polish. People aren't telling Polak jokes anymore. But at one point that was hilarious, and so were racist jokes and sexist jokes, and those jokes aren't funny anymore. I've been watching during this lockdown some of the old vacation movies, Chevy Chase vacation movies, that in the 80s seemed hilarious and now seem just problematic. They're like not funny. And there's stuff that is hilarious now that 30 years from now probably won't seem that funny. So we think that our humor is just natural. It's just naturally funny. But it has a lot to do with the social context that we're in. Comedians have this line, which is tragedy plus time equals comedy. Like this notion of too soon. When is it too soon to tell a joke? Can you tell a joke about people dying of coronavirus? No, there's 1,000 people a day dying of this horrible disease. 10 years from now, maybe, right? 10 years from now, it might be kind of fun. Jokes about the bubonic plague are hilarious. At the time, not so much. So what we find funny in our bones is a product of what we are sort of socialized to understand. Like, oh, that's funny. It's not naturally funny, except for fart jokes. Fart jokes will always be naturally funny. That we sort of learn, that's really not that funny. I mean, jokes that were, watch some 80s movies. Watch, Weird Science, which I saw 3 times in the 80s because I thought it was so funny. And I watched it recently and I was just embarrassed. It was not funny at all. That comedy changes, humor changes because of the social setting that we're in. So all these, Goffman and Elfman, and talking about gender and language and talking about humor, all examples of how on a very micro level we are incorporating our environment. We are incorporating where we are in the world and when we are in the world to make sense of these very micro level things. And that's a quick lecture on social interaction. There, I did it. All right. Socially interact. Peace.